Did you know that a woman is only fertile for around 6 days every cycle? And not every day, like what high school sex ed teachers will have us believe to try and scare us into abstaining. So what that means is around only 20% of a cycle is a time that you can actually get pregnant. And in the other 80%, no matter how much sex you're having, it's just not possible. We call this 20% the fertile window. And it's made up of around 5 days leading up to ovulation and the day of ovulation itself. So if you're somebody who is trying to conceive, having sex in this fertile window is what you need to do in order to get pregnant. Miss it, and pregnancy is just not going to happen that cycle, even if you're doing everything else right. So the question to ask then is, how do you know when you are in that fertile time? And that's what I'm going to be going through in this video. So if you are somebody who is trying to get pregnant, stick around. So to understand ovulation and what's happening in your fertile window, you need to understand what is happening in your menstrual cycle leading up to that point. Your whole cycle is basically controlled by a communication that happens between the brain and the ovaries, and the messengers are the hormones. So at the start of your cycle, from day one, you are in what's known as the menstrual phase. And this is the phase that most people are familiar with because there is actually something to see, and there is a biomarker telling you what phase you are in. That biomarker is your period, it's your bleed, and what it is your endometrium, the lining inside the uterus that is sloughing off from the previous cycle. At this point in your cycle, the hormones that run everything are relatively low, and it's this drop in hormones that causes the endometrium to be shed. But this is also what signals to the brain that it is time to start a new cycle. Much like the seasons of the year, there never really is a stop in what is happening in your cycle. It's more just about different hormones fluctuating at different levels, bringing about different things at different parts. So this lull in hormones triggers the brain to start secreting the sort of driver of the first part of the cycle, and that is follicle stimulating hormone, or FSH. FSH sends an instruction to the ovaries to tell them to start recruiting follicles and getting them to grow and mature. And these little follicles are actually what house the eggs that are needed for fertilization. So in the early part of the cycle, a whole bunch of follicles get recruited, but as the days go by, there will eventually be a front runner that takes the lead and starts growing and maturing faster and bigger than the others, and this follicle is called the dominant follicle or the lead follicle. And in a particular cycle, this will be the egg that gets ovulated. Now, as these follicles grow and as the dominant follicle grows and gets bigger, what happens is they start secreting estrogen. The estrogen is secreted from a layer of cells that surround the follicles, and the bigger they get and the more they mature, the more they secrete estrogen. So the level of estrogen increases inside the body. And estrogen is responsible for a couple of things. It helps the endometrium to regrow. It causes a change in cervical mucus from a very thick, sticky, tacky, protective barrier to the uterus to something that is more fluid and wet and runny and fertile, and it helps with conception. And lastly, it signals to the brain that there is a mature lead follicle ready and waiting to be ovulated and then in due course fertilized. Once estrogen reaches a certain peak level, the brain interprets this, and then what it does is it starts secreting a hormone called luteinizing hormone. This hormone is released into the body and it makes its way down to the ovaries, where it signals to the ovaries that it's time to release the egg that was growing in that follicle out into the open. So luteinizing hormone is then secreted in pulses, and eventually this will cause that follicle to be released, which is then ovulation. And ovulation is the highlight of the cycle because it is the only time that an egg is out and available to be in contact with sperm. So it is the only time that a woman can get pregnant. So all of these changes that happen leading up to ovulation are what is called your fertile window. These changes prepare the reproductive tract support sperm survival, and ultimately support fertilization. And that is why by recognizing these changes, these signals, you can identify when your fertile window is opening. And then you can make informed decisions and time sex correctly instead of just taking a swing in the dark every month and hoping for the best. Now, the reason it is so important to capitalize on this window of opportunity is because sadly, that window closes very quickly once ovulation has happened. So once that egg is released from that ovary, it is only viable for around 24 hours. After which it essentially dies off and then no more fertilization can take place. So once that egg is no longer viable, pregnancy cannot be achieved. Okay, so now if you're wondering why that fertile window is 6 days long, when I just said that after ovulation that egg is only viable for 24 hours, that is thanks to the wonderful protective and supportive function of fertile cervical mucus that gets secreted in the days leading up to ovulation. If you haven't yet watched my video on why cervical mucus is so important for fertility, I will link it up here. But just for the purpose of this video, I'll give you a quick recap on why cervical mucus is so important. So cervical mucus changes to become fertile cervical mucus when those estrogen levels rise to that really high level when that dominant follicle is growing. And what this does is it basically creates a safe protective space for sperm to live in and hide out in until that egg gets released. So what happens then is if you have sex within those days that there is fertile cervical mucus present, you can extend that window from 24 hours to those 6 days. And the chances of pregnancy is still really high because that sperm can live safely inside the female, waiting for that egg to be released. And then once that egg is released, the sperm's already there. So the chances of conception are really high. Cool. With me at this point, you know that the fertile window is around 5 days before ovulation, including the day of ovulation. And you know that ovulation is the only time that a woman can actually fall pregnant, right? But now the question is, when do those 5 days actually start? And in order to know that, you have to know when you are about to ovulate. And this is often where a bit of confusion comes in. Because if you go and read online or you speak to the majority of people, they will tell you that ovulation happens on day 14 as like a standard rule. And actually, that is not how it goes. Because not everybody has a 28-day cycle. And even if you do have a 28-day cycle, there might be cycles that differ slightly. So cycle to cycle, there could be variations, which is then going to change the day of ovulation. So in other words, the timing of ovulation depends entirely on you and your own cycle and the health of your cycle. And that is why using the calendar method or certain apps that kind of give you a prediction without taking a look at your body's biomarkers is not a reliable way of guessing when you're going to ovulate. Fortunately though, there are a few tools that you can use that are a lot more individualized and custom made to your own body that help predict, affirm, and confirm when you're about to ovulate or when you've ovulated. So coming in at number 1, and my personal favorite, is cervical mucus. So as I said, as estrogen rises before ovulation, what this does is it causes a change in the texture, the color, the consistency, and the feel of cervical mucus. So during the non-fertile days, like before the fertile window opens and once ovulation has taken place, cervical mucus is usually like white, sticky, tacky, glue-like, cloudy, and it has a very special function. It protects the uterus from weird things, pathogens and stuff getting inside of it. However, when your fertile window opens and the uterus is now receptive to things like sperm and that kind of stuff, what happens is it changes to a more slippery, clear, wet, stretchy consistency. And this we call fertile cervical mucus. And just before ovulation, you often see a change to what we call peak fluid or peak cervical mucus, and that very closely resembles raw egg white. You can actually put it in between your fingers and stretch it open, and it doesn't break. So if you are somebody who is wanting to track where they are in their cycle, by tracking your cervical mucus and noticing these small changes, the shift from the white, sticky, non-fertile mucus to the thin, clear, runny, fertile mucus, can tell you when you are getting into that fertile window. So it is an excellent predictor of when you're about to ovulate. The next tool that you can use to try and predict ovulation is called an ovulation predictor kit, or an OPK. So when estrogen rises and causes that signal to the brain that a lead follicle is ready to be released during ovulation, the brain picks up this signal and releases the hormone, luteinizing hormone, like I spoke about earlier. Now, this luteinizing hormone goes into your body and into the bloodstream and gets filtered through the kidneys, and it eventually comes out in your urine. So the wonderful scientists out there have developed a little dipstick that looks like a pregnancy test that you can use to test for luteinizing hormone and the presence of it in your urine. So again, if you're somebody who's tracking your cycle, you'll start using ovulation predictor kits at a certain time in your cycle, and you'll look out for either the presence of luteinizing hormone, which the OPK will tell you, and then you know that you're going into that fertile window. And then just before you're about to ovulate, that little test will give you a positive and let you know that there is a lot of luteinizing hormone that's present in the body. And ovulation usually happens around 24 to 36 hours after you get a positive OPK. Then there are a couple of ways that you can affirm that you are approaching ovulation and that you're in your fertile window. And the two things that you'll look at with that is changes in your cervix. So when you are non-fertile and the cervix is trying to keep things out of the body, it is usually a bit lower down in the body. And so if you had to use a finger to feel for it, you might feel it a lot quicker because it's a lot lower down in the body. And also the cervix feels a little bit firm. So it feels almost like you're pushing on the tip of your nose. But once you are getting to the fertile phase, when the cervix has to allow things to move through it, it softens a bit. So what often you'll feel is that it sits higher in the body. So again, if you do a finger test, it's a little bit harder to reach. It's a little bit higher up. And also it feels a lot softer. So it feels a bit like touching your lip. So firm is touching your nose, soft is touching the lip. And those are changes that you can feel in the cervix, and you can kind of put it alongside the other things that you're seeing and go, okay, yes, I'm seeing changes in my cervical mucus and I'm feeling changes in my cervix. So that is an affirmation that you are in your fertile window. Other symptoms that also serve as affirmations are just general things that you might feel in your body when you are approaching ovulation. And this can be things like tender breasts, bloating, one-sided abdominal pain, kind of like a period cramp. Some women even get mid-cycle spotting, which is like a little bit of blood. It's usually a little bit brown and there isn't a lot of it. And that sometimes happens because there is a rupture of the ovary where that egg must come out. You might notice that you've got an increased libido because around ovulation, your levels of testosterone are also increased because your body is trying to get you to be a little bit more interested in sex, because this is the time that your body wants you to have sex to get pregnant. You might find that your energy levels are a bit higher and you're feeling a little bit more creative, a little bit more carefree, a little bit more social. And these are all, again, things that you can note and go, this is how I'm feeling at the moment. And my cervical mucus and my OPKs and all of that are starting to show that I'm approaching ovulation. So this is just an affirmation that I am, in fact, in my fertile window. Then I also just want to touch on a way to confirm that ovulation has happened. So it's all good and well that you are able to predict when ovulation is going to happen and you're getting all of these like fertile signs, but you are not going to get pregnant unless you are in fact ovulating. So it is just as important to confirm that you are ovulating, because a lot of women struggle with anovulatory cycles. Now, these can happen from time to time, every now and then. But if this is something that is happening on a regular basis, it's something that needs to be assessed as to why that's happening. Because if there's no ovulation, there is no chance of pregnancy. So you need to be able to find a way to confirm that you've ovulated. And the tool for that is by tracking your basal body temperature. So basal body temperature is the lowest temperature that your body gets to when you are at rest, and it fluctuates based on the hormones that are present. So in the first half of the cycle before ovulation, the main hormones that are present are estrogen and FSH, whereas after ovulation has occurred, in the luteal phase, the hormone that is the ringleader there is called progesterone. And progesterone has an effect on your basal body temperature. It causes a rise in the temperature. So if you're somebody who's tracking their cycles and you're taking your temperature every day and you see that your temperature has shot up and stays high for a couple of days, you know that ovulation did in fact happen. The limitation with this, and one point that I really want to just drive home, is that tracking your basal body temperature is a retrospective biomarker that ovulation happened. You cannot be tracking your temperatures to predict when it is going to happen. And if you're waiting to see a temperature rise before you're having sex, what you've actually done is completely missed your window, because ovulation then has already occurred. There are also a number of apps out there that say that they can predict when you're in your fertile window and when you are going to ovulate. And while I absolutely love apps, I have a phone that's full of them. I use the Temp Drop app with my wearable thermometer to track my basal body temperature, and I use the Premom app to check my OPKs and keep a record of that. These apps only work if you're inputting data into them on a daily basis. And this data includes things like basal body temperature, results from OPKs, observations in your cervical mucus changes, that kind of stuff. An app without getting your data on a daily basis is not going to be able to tell you when you are in your fertile window and when you're going to ovulate. Those apps are then basically just relying on the calendar method or taking the length of your cycle and guessing when you're going into your fertile phase and when you're going to ovulate. And yes, for some women, this might be enough and you might get lucky and fall pregnant with this kind of information. But on the whole, this is not customized enough to your body for you to know exactly when you are ovulating, which is the whole point of this. So as you can see, once you start understanding ovulation and learning how to identify your fertile window, you take the guesswork out of when is the best time for you specifically to be having sex in order to get pregnant. Now, if you would like a cheat sheet on everything we've just spoken about, I have created a little downloadable form that you can find down in the description. And I really want you to use this in the next couple of months because tracking your fertile window and ovulation is so important. And if you are someone who is planning on getting pregnant in the next couple of months, there are a number of other ways that you can help support your fertility by doing certain things and protect your fertility by avoiding other things. And that is what I'm going to cover in this next video. So go give it a watch if you're interested, and I'll see you in the next one. Take care and goodbye.